Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the 18th podcast. So today we have a very special guest. There are many Muslims around the world who believe that evolution clashes directly with their core Islamic beliefs, especially in regards to the creation of Adam. But then there are some Muslim scholars who have done their research who believe that evolution, you can believe in Darwinian evolution, macro evolution, and still remain an orthodox Muslim. And one such guest is Dr. Usama Hasan. He is a physicist, Imam, educator, and public intellectual known for engaging deeply with relationship between science and Islam. Quite remarkably, he memorized Quran at the age of 11. He has done imamat and kitabat, including Taraweeh, Juma, and UK Mass for over 40 years. Also to his name, Isnad in Haziz, Ijaza from Pakistan, Morocco, and UK. He has his PhD in artificial intelligence. He has studied physics at Cambridge. He has published a number of translations of classical Islamic texts from Arabic and Urdu into English. Co-authored Interfaith Dialogue book as well. He was a visiting associate professor in artificial intelligence at NUST in Pakistan. He's a freelance consultant on Islam, politics, and science. And quite recently, he shared this stuff as well, that he served as co-author and convener of the Muslim World Science Initiative final report of the Task Force on Science and Islam, the big questions, and it was chaired by the former Secretary General of the OIC. His work especially focuses on one difficult question many believers struggle with today that we alluded to earlier in our intro. Can traditional Islamic belief coexist with modern scientific theories like evolution? So Dr. Usama Hasan, you are most welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Wa alaikum assalam. So, the very first question right off the bat, is evolution a theory or a fact, according to you?
My answer to that is now evolution is clearly a fact. It's not just a theory anymore. And this is one of the big misconceptions which people use to say, well, it's just a theory, you see. But if a theory has been tested millions of times and always proven to be correct, then we regard it as a fact. A bit like gravity. It's like we don't regard gravity as a theory, as Newton's theory anymore. Gravity is just a fact that everybody knows and understands, and because we experience it all the time, and we can see it.
So just to be clear, are we talking about macro evolution, not the micro evolution? Because most of the students that I've discussed this theory with, they believe micro evolution is true, macro evolution is true as well. But when it comes to Adam, that creation was special. So in your theory, according to you, when you say that evolution is a fact, not a theory, that means the conception of Adam, his creation, that was part of that process as well.
Yes, so human evolution is part of that. So biological evolution, the evolution of all living species, all connected in the family tree. And I have some slides on this, which I will present very soon. All the biology, all the evidence of biology points to that. And as scientists, remember, it was the Muslim world, it was the Muslims who developed the scientific method. We're talking about Ibn Sina and Al-Bayruni, and people like that, and many others. So, for example, Professor Gimal Khalili here in Britain read the book Pathfinders, and many others have pointed out that it was actually the Muslims who developed the scientific method and basically taught it to the West and helped spark the Renaissance and the scientific revolution in the West. And then the Western world reached the ascendancy where it still has in matters of science and technology. But before that, it was centuries of the Muslim world leading that subject. Now, and then Muslim world sadly declined. And the Muslim World Science Initiative that you mentioned, with whom I worked with the task force report, one of the objectives is to try to revive the science and technology in the Muslim world. Now, as Muslims and as scientists, as the great pioneers of science, who took Aristotle's old method but improved it, because there were scientists before the Muslims, of course, in India, China, Greece, ancient Greece, especially ancient Rome. So we think of Aristotle. But it was the Muslims who developed really the scientific method to what we know. Theory, test it with experiment, change your theory if the experimental results indicate otherwise, etc. So just applying that to biology, there is overwhelming evidence for all of this evolution, and it actually applies to human beings as well. Because, for example, as I have in one of my slides, human beings have 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 in total. And some of the apes, I think it's a chimpanzee, some of the great apes, have identical DNA, except for the chimps who have 48, actually. They have one pair which is different, one extra pair. But we even have we've even been able to image and work out exactly what that extra pair looks like. And what we see is that how did that go missing between the chimps and the human beings? We actually see two pairs of chromosomes of the chimpanzee which are fused. One pair of chromosomes which is fused to make a human one. So, and we can actually see that in the shape of it. It's direct evidence. And so the human beings have the same DNA, but instead of 24, you now have 23 pairs of chromosomes, for example. And there are many other indications, actually, and there's no logical reason why the process of biological evolution, because we're made of the same cells and molecules, atoms and molecules, the same chemical compounds, biochemical compounds, as animals and plants. And we can see, as is well known with the human DNA, which had all been mapped out, the Human Genome Project, is that we are related to every other living species, all other animals and plants. So there is no reason to accept human beings from this. The biggest objection, the biggest reason why many Muslims actually reject the idea of human evolution is they believe it contradicts the Quran. And so the science is settled. If you ask any biologist, especially a human biologist, they will confirm what I just said. But the big question actually is, does this go against the Quran? So is it like kufr or blasphemy, or is this compatible with our understanding of the Quran? Is this compatible with the teaching of the Quran? And the main part of my work, because I'm not a biologist, I'm a physicist, is to show that all of the objection that people quote from the Quran against this are actually unfounded, or there are answers to all of this. And I show how great Muslim scholars of the last 150 years actually recognize this and accepted human evolution. And Allama Iqbal is one of them, and I quote him. This is well known in his famous lectures, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. He quotes Rumi on this, but he says, as many of the scholars said, Dr. Hamidullah as well. Dr. Hamidullah, who was a great Islamic scholar, originally of India and Pakistan origin, based in France. He also pointed out that it was Muslim scholars who had developed these ideas actually way before Darwin, and there are Western scholars who credited Muslim scientists and philosophers, scholars, with the precursory ideas to Darwin. There's no doubt that the great British scientist Darwin put all the strands together and came up with the theory of evolution in his famous Origin of the Species in 1863, was it roughly when it was published. But he was influenced by older ideas from, say, the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, Al-Jahiz and others.
So, Dr. Usama, the problem when I discuss this theory with my students, because I do not have adequate education or information with regards to this theory. So I say these are the experts and this is their opinion and they believe it's a fact. They quote Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, famous loudmouth atheist. He's an evolutionary biologist. So he said, you can, as a believer, you can believe in evolution as well. You don't have to be an atheist to believe in evolution. But once you accept evolution, it is easier to become, I'm paraphrasing him, it is easier to become atheist. So do you believe this is one of the reasons why believers, they tend to reject this theory or fact?
Yes, I agree. It's one of the biggest reasons. And I actually have a couple of slides on this. Is a lot of people think that if you accept evolution, including human evolution, then necessarily you have to become an atheist, or you have, or you have to deny God. God forbid. And I've actually met Professor Dawkins once. I had a long chat with him because in around 2012-13, I was invited to give the Darendorf lecture on freedom at the University of Oxford, at Professor Dawkins' college, actually, and we had lunch beforehand, and we had a long conversation. And what I've realized, talking to him and listening to him publicly, is that, and I've read one or two of his books, that he's obviously a great biologist, but I'll say this publicly, he's a very poor philosopher or theologian. He really does not understand philosophy or theology, and his arguments are very, very weak around God and religion and theology, because he basically has a very limited basic understanding of what religion and beliefs are about. And in fact, he contradicts himself. So, for example, once he said that all religion is child abuse. For example, teaching religion to children is child abuse, he said. But at the same time, he says he respects what he called Einsteinian religion. And Einstein and Dirac, two of the great physicists of the 20th century, for example, had a very mystical, if you like, Sufi view of religion. And, Einstein believed in God. And as far as I know, Dirac did as well. But they were top scientists. And Dawkins likes the way they talked about religion and God, which was actually in a very Sufi way, mystical way. But he's contradicting himself when he's saying all religion is child abuse, but Einsteinian religion is okay. And what he said, it becomes easier to become an atheist. It's just not true, because there are millions of scientists. If you look at the United States, most scientists believe in God. You look in Europe, probably less so. But say, for example, in India, Pakistan, and the Muslim world, you have millions of scientists, but they all believe in God. Because, and for me, alhamdulillah, Imam Saab as well, as a scientist, I've been trained in both Quran and Hadith, but also physics and artificial intelligence, etc. So for me, it's just very clear that God is the source of all of these. The two have the same source. All knowledge ultimately comes from God, either through revelation, through God's revelation, like the holy books, the scriptures, the last of which is the Quran, and or through our study of the natural world, which in the Quran especially invites us to do, reflect on the signs of God, ayatullah, to reflect on the signs. And the Quran is full of, the first revelation was read and recite, but to study. There are signs for people to think, people who know, signs for people who understand. The Quran is full of this, and it is that which actually inspired the great Muslim civilizations to study, think, experiment, observe, and lead the world for centuries in science and technology. So when you realize religion and science come from the same source, the same one unified source, who is the one God, then it's very easy to keep your faith and also be a scientist. But we do have to answer the objections, because people quote particular verses or ideas and say, well, this goes against evolution. And I believe it through my writings and lecturing, especially my major paper on the topic of Islam and evolution. I've actually listed all of those arguments based on the Quran and actually answered them all very thoroughly.
Yeah, so I would love to see those slides, that presentation that you have prepared for us.
So if you could show it on screen, I think I can take it.
Perfect. It's done.
Yeah,
it's on screen now.
Yeah, okay, great. So there we are. I call it Islam and the theory fact of evolution because, I would say it's a fact. Remember, just like gravity, it's just, and especially biologists know that there are millions of pieces of evidence. There's a summary which I will go through. So I'll start with current Muslim responses to evolution. So to my mind, when you ask Muslims about evolution, there's three major responses you get from people, three types of response. Number one is to reject all of biological evolution. And there was this is a pen name, a pseudonym, somebody in Turkey whose name was Adnan Oktar, but he went by the pen name of Harun Yahya. He's most famous for that view because...
Is that the same guy who was he was found guilty of multiple charges if I
Yes,
remember.
he's now in prison for a very long time. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
This is a political matter. He used to be very close to Erdogan and also to the Gulen, Fethullah Gulen. Those three used to be very close together, and then all three had big arguments, as well known as a political thing. So three of them separated. But yeah, Harun Yahya was well funded, and he flooded the world with literature in dozens of languages, actually copying the arguments of what we call Christian fundamentalists, and put an Islamic wrapper on them. Whereas, as we will see in this presentation, when Darwin first published his theory, John William Draper, a great American stroke British scientist, wrote in an important book at the time in the 19th century, in his history of science and religion. He said that we should learn from the Muslim world, who are comfortable with evolutionary ideas and in fact basically invented them, and they're much more comfortable with evolution, whereas we Christians are against evolution, because at first, evolution was rejected by the Christians and the Christian church, etc. So anyway, Harun Yahya actually borrowed the Christian fundamentalist arguments. The second position, which is what I think you mentioned from some of your students, when you said they accept microevolution but not macroevolution, the second one is to say we accept all of biological evolution except human evolution. And there are many Muslim theologians who take that view. I won't name them here. The third view is to accept all of biological evolution, and I'm in that category. And as I say, many Muslim biologists and some theologians, Islamic scholars, accept number 3. I also question many people go from 1 to 2 to 3. In my own journey, when I was younger, and I hadn't really studied this carefully, and I was a physicist, not a biologist. I only did 2 years of biology at secondary school, actually. It was just one of those things. For various reasons, I dropped biology at secondary school. So I never knew much biology. And I slowly, over a period of, 10 or 20 years, I slowly went from 1 to 2 to 3 myself. So I know that this is a very common intellectual journey that people take. And a related question is, are we part of the web of life, or are we a special case? And that's what it boils down to. Your question, of micro and macro evolution, it boils down to that same question. Is human evolution part of evolution? And if it is, then we are not a special case. We are part of the web of life. But if we say, well, the human evolution was special, then we are a special case. Now, this is where I quote from Professor Ihab Abu Haif, who is a practicing Muslim, believing Muslim biologist based in Canada. And this slide I've shared with his permission from him. And this is one of the slides that biologists will show with, you've got the DNA on the left, and you've got a web of life, which, has many, many animal species, including humans. So, for example, you can see squid at the top there, fruit flies around the middle there, and human beings down here. So biologists will tell you, based on the DNA, as I said earlier, we are related to every other living species, plants and animals, and we can actually see that in the DNA. And that's why it's all the biology, the science points to humans being part of the web of life. So we're not a special case. And in fact, I should just go back and say that there are Muslim intellectuals who are struggling to accept number 3. So they're trying very hard to come up with new theories to support number 2, with recent ideas in the academic literature called Adamic or Adamic exceptionalism, etc. But I believe, that's all fundamentally wrong. And it's because they haven't accepted the arguments as to why it is acceptable for Muslims, practicing Muslims, to just accept this basic science. And if they were to accept that, and this is one of the authors who's talking about that. I won't go into that, but his book, Islam and Biological Evolution, he shows 3 possibilities in which Adam is a special case in each case you see. By the way, just on the word orthodox, you asked the question, can Muslims remain orthodox? I just wanted to mention what the word orthodox means. You see, in English, orthodox comes from the Greek. Ortho means right, and dox is to speak. So orthodox means speaking the truth. So, this is why a right angle in maths is called orthogonal rather than diagonal. That's a diagonal. And if it's right angle, it's called orthogonal. Ortho means right, correct. So orthodox just means speaking the truth. And, a lot of people claim that their view is orthodox to dismiss another view. Whereas I say, look, if you speak the truth, then you are orthodox by definition. Yeah, and that's what the English word means. Okay. Now, as I said, I'm a biologist, but this is what I got from biology textbooks. Sorry, I'm not a biologist, I'm a physicist. But biologists will say, look, this is the overwhelming evidence for evolution, including human evolution. And it's actually not just from biology. So there's paleontology, the fossil record, there's the geographical distribution of species. So, for example, famously, there's only certain species that are only found on isolated islands like Madagascar or Galapagos Islands, which Darwin discovered, or Australia, kangaroos and wallabies and things only evolved in Australia, which shows the mechanisms of evolution are correct and they weren't able to cross large sea barriers. Comparative anatomy, we just look at the bodies. And here there's a book called Your Inner Fish, for example, which shows that, the 5 digits that all human beings have in the hands and the feet, they are found right across the mammal world, but even in fish, primitive version of the 5 limbs are there. And well, that's why Professor Dawkins, I think, endorsed a book called, or maybe he wrote it, called Your Grandmother Fish. He said we shouldn't teach about Adam and Eve. We should teach that we all came from a fish, your grandmother fish. But, that's not an inspiring story. I think it's better to teach the very inspiring story of Adam and Eve in the garden and the fall and all that, rather than teaching children that we all came from a fish. Because one is a purely atheist scientific perspective. The other one combines religion and science, which I favor. Okay, then there's molecular biology, including genetics and DNA. Like I said, DNA just shows directly, and DNA is very mathematical, remember. The DNA is a digital mathematical system, the way it works. And actually, I learned that from Richard Dawkins' book, River Out of Eden. It's called River Out of Eden. Eden is the Garden of Eden of Adam and Eve, Jannatu Adam. And the river is actually a digital river. It's, but with 4 bases, A, D, C, and T, rather than a binary. But the mathematics of DNA is amazing. And the whole field of mathematical biology, which, amongst other things, looks at how DNA is actually a mathematical system. And it's very precise. So there's massive evidence there. Then there's embryology, there's taxonomy. And, by the way, I know a Muslim scientist whose research is about the menstrual periods in the great apes, chimpanzees and gorillas and things, and how similar that is to human beings, the female menstrual periods. I know another scientist who's working on, a top biologist. He's based in Italy, actually. The first one is based in the United States. The second one is based in Italy, who is working on hibernation, because scientists have found the switch that the switches on. They found the gene which is responsible for hibernation among certain mammals, like bears and other mammals, and that gene is present in the human DNA as well, but it's switched off. That's why human beings do not hibernate. But he's researching, for example, and under what condition might it be possible to switch on that gene for human beings, so perhaps in extreme circumstances human beings could hibernate, for example. So those are some of the things which comes up in the similarity of the bodies and their functions. I gave the example of the 46 chromosomes, the 23 pairs that human beings have. Chimps have 48. And human chromosome number 2, precisely, the fusion of 2 chimpanzee chromosomes. And anybody who's interested in the diagram for that can just look it up online, look for the image of that. I would go first to say that there is scientific ijma, or consensus, on the fact of evolution. Okay, so there's no argument really about the biology. It's a bit like saying, if you say to a biologist, "Oh, evolution is not true," it's a bit like saying to a physicist that gravity is not true, or relativity is not true. It's just a theory. But gravity and Einstein's relativity and quantum physics, most of it, we know quantum physics is incomplete because The physicists are still trying to combine quantum physics and gravity. That's well known. But all the theories have been tested millions of times, and from everything they say, they pass all the tests. They're correct. So saying to a biologist, well, but evolution is not true, it's just a theory, would be like saying to a physicist that gravity, quantum theory, relativity is just a theory, it's not true. It would be actually laughable. Right. Now, this is where I go into, then how can practicing Muslims, believing Muslims, accept evolution? So as I mentioned, this is a quote from Sir John William Draper, who was a British scientist who became head of the American Physical Society. He lived in the 19th century between 1811 to 1882. So, Darwin's book was published 20 years before he died. And he wrote an important book called The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, which is available online. And he refers to evolution as basically a Muslim theory. He called it the Muhammadan, meaning Muslim theory, of the evolution of man from lower forms, or his gradual development to his present condition in the long lapse of time. He goes on to say, sometimes not without surprise, we meet with ideas which we flatter ourselves have originated in our own times. Thus, our modern doctrines of evolution and development were taught in their schools, meaning in the Muslim schools. In fact, they carried them much farther than we are disposed to do, extending them even to inorganic or mineral things. So I'll just pause there if you had any comments or questions on that before I continue about what I've said so far.
Yeah, there's only one question that comes to mind. Are there any Muslim scientists who still contest this idea that evolution, macroevolution, Darwinian evolution is a fact? Are there some Muslim scientists, renowned Muslim scientists, who still believe that there is enough room for reinterpretation and there is still research, ongoing research that can still prove that evolution is not true?
I don't know of any. No, I don't know of any scientists. No serious biologists contest this, as far as I know. Yeah, and this is something to ask biologists. The only Muslims disputing this they're basically philosophers or theologians, and they're basing it actually on philosophical arguments or what the so-called Islamic tradition said. Some of them keep talking about the Islamic tradition, and as I will show, actually, in the Islamic tradition, as Draper said, Islamic tradition was actually classically perfectly fine with the idea of evolution. So yeah, so my answer to that is no. No serious scientist, whether Muslim or not, will deny macroevolution, human evolution. There's another professor who took part in a famous debate on this topic in 2011. And myself and Professor Ihab Abu Haifa on the same side. The third one was somebody called Professor Fatima Jackson, who is a African-American Muslim professor of human evolution in particular. So she's an expert in, Homo habilis and Homo australis and the Neanderthals and all the hominin species. And she wears an abaya and scarf, by the way. She spoke at this debate wearing an abaya and scarf. That's how she dresses. Traditional veiled Muslim woman. And she accepts all of this 100% also, that human evolution is part of evolution. It's just a basic fact. And she studied thousands of fossils of hominid species. Yeah. So I think that's important to know that the science, there's no doubt about the science. All the arguments are based around religion and philosophy. So if you read the book Darwin's Ghosts, which I recommend, by Rebecca Stott, chapter 3, her book Darwin's Ghosts, by ghosts she means the people from the past who influenced these ideas. She had a whole chapter on the famous African Islamic scholar called Al-Jahid, 9th century, 776 to 869. So that's roughly what the 2nd to 3rd centuries of Islam. He spoke about the struggle for existence. Okay? In his famous book Kitab al-Hayawan, he spoke about the influence of the environment and animal survival in his Book of Animals. He came up with a crude Lamarckism that was later replaced by Darwinian evolution. For those interested in biology, just before Darwin, there was a scientist called Lamarck who had a slightly wrong but similar theory to Darwin, but Darwin improved on Lamarckism. The Lamarckism was close to what Al-Jahid wrote centuries earlier. He also wrote that dogs, foxes, and wolves must have descended from a common ancestor, and that's quoted by Jim al-Khalili in his Pathfinders. So he understood ecosystem, he took about ecological systems, natural selection, and common descent. Actually, this should say common descent more than natural selection, and adaptation, because it was really Darwin who came up with natural selection. So that's a slight mistake on the slide. Instead of natural selection, there you should say common descent. So he gave the example. Just by observing dogs, foxes, and wolves, he said they must have descended from a common ancestor. Okay, they're so similar, they're different species, but they're similar enough. Okay, there were other people with precursory ideas to evolution, like the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity. One of them was Ibn Miskawayh, and they were in Persia in the 10th century. So, for example, they talked about the worlds, the mineral world, the plant world, the animal world, and the human world in a succession. And they mentioned the monkey in between, animal and the human. Now we would say the great apes, to be precise, because, monkeys, the primates include smaller monkeys and the great apes like chimpanzees and gorillas and things. And the source for this is Dr. Muhammad Hamidullah, said the famous 20th century hadith scholar of Indian origin who was based in, or Indian Pakistani origin, who was based in Paris for decades toward the end of his life and published on this. Now, related to that is Ibn Khaldun's famous quote from the Muqaddimah, 14th century. He died in 1408 of the Common Era. So that is roughly 8th century of Islam. This is a famous quote from the Muqaddimah. And this is Rosenthal, Dawood's translation, Rosenthal's translation. He says, one should then look at the world of creation. It started out from the minerals and progressed in an ingenious, gradual manner to plants and animals. The last stage of minerals is connected with the first stage of plants, such as herbs and seedless plants. The last stage of plants, such as palms and vines, is connected with the first stage of animals, such as snails and shellfish, which have only the power of touch. The word connection with regard to these created things means that the last stage of each group is fully prepared to become the first stage of the next group. He goes on to say, the animal world then widens, its species become numerous, and in a gradual process of creation, it finally leads to man, who is able to think and to reflect. The highest stage of man is reached from the world of the monkeys, in which both sagacity, meaning wisdom, wisdom, and perception are found, but which has not reached the stage of actual reflection and thinking. At this point, we come to the first stage of man. This is as far as our physical observation extends. So you see, Ibn Khaldun is saying the same as that line there, but very eloquently. And he mentions the monkeys just before human beings. And crucially, the last sentence, that this is based on observation. Just observing from the mineral to the plant to the animal to the apes and to human beings. And there's the reference, because the Muqaddimah, the full translation is in 3 volumes, but because Ibn Khaldun repeats himself a lot, that was by Rosenthal. Then M.J. Dawood abridged those 3 volumes down into 1 volume. It took me a year to read that book, and it changed my life, actually. But there's the quote. Right. Now, to be fair, Ibn Khaldun, these are precursory ideas. Ibn Khaldun is not talking about Darwinian evolution directly. At that time, this was this medieval idea about the great chain of being. That's really what they were talking about, the chain of being. But there's no doubt, as the author of Darwin's Ghost says, that those ideas helped develop in the minds of later Western scientists like Darwin the idea of evolution. Because they're showing, you can see it's all part of the web of life. And for the Muslim scientists, even the mineral world, pebbles are like stones, you see. So they were very clever. Now, Allama Iqbal quotes Rumi here and says that, in kind of Sufi thinking, the idea is that everything that God has created is one unified creation, and the Spirit of God moves through all of this and reaches its culmination in the human being when God breathes his own spirit into Adam. But this is Rumi's eloquent poem. Low in the earth, I lived in realms of ore and stone. So that's the mineral world. Then I smiled in many tinted flowers. That's the plant world. Then roving with the wild and wandering hours over earth and air and ocean zone. In a new birth, I dived and flew and crept and ran. So that's the land animals, earth and air, that's the birds, and ocean zone, that's the fish or sea creatures. And all the secret of my essence drew within a form that brought them all to view, and lo, a man. So he's talking about the same idea, but very poetically. And then my goal beyond the clouds, beyond the sky, in realms where none may change or die, in angel form, and then away beyond the bounds of night and day, and life and death, unseen or seen, where all that is hath ever been as one and whole. So you see, it's one and whole, but he also mentioned the angels there. Ibn Khaldun, by the way, in that other passage, the next paragraph, he also talks about the angels. He talks about what the Islamic scholars said, that the Prophet, peace be upon him, for example, the prophets, and the Prophet Muhammad in particular, but all of the prophets, were such pure human beings that their character was angelic. Because, the traditional teaching, which is true, which I fully believe in, that human beings are a mixture of angel and animal. We have angelic aspect and an animal aspect. And the purpose of life in religion is to try to purify ourselves, that we become like the angels and not like wild animals, basically savage animals. And the prophets were able to receive revelation, for example, and speak to the angels, and the great prophets received revelation directly from angel Gabriel, Jibril, because they'd reached that stage of interfacing, if you like, between human and angel. That's where the angel bit comes from. Anyway, Allama Iqbal, it's worth reading the whole section. You see, he quotes Rumi in that context to say there is no problem with the theory of evolution, and it shouldn't be causing such controversy. Did you have any thoughts on that? Are you familiar with Allama Iqbal's view on the topic, his writings?
And I had read the reconstruction of religious thoughts back in Corona days, but I wasn't familiar with this fact that he was alluding to evolution as well when he was quoting Rumi. Rumi, by the way, is one of my favorite poets. As a student of literature, I really admire his poetry. But whenever I read Rumi, it's like there are myriads of interpretations that we can derive from his poetry. So I didn't know that he was referring, but as you say, surprises.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, Rumi didn't talk about evolution, but what Allama Iqbal did, he this is a basic Sufi teaching. When Sufi is the inner teaching of the Quran and of the scriptures, which is to say, it's that last line, was one and whole. Everything that has ever been is one and whole, meaning all of God's creation is one. In the end, it's unified, and it reflects the unity of God. And Allama Iqbal was alluding to that, is that the idea that we are related to we human beings are related to animals. He's basically saying this should not shock us, because this has always been the Sufi teaching, that all of creation is one and whole, is unified, and therefore the idea that we are related to animals is not a problem. Yeah. Okay.
There's one thing I would like to say here. Why when I discuss this subject with my students or my colleagues, my friends, they say this one thing, that as an atheist, when you're an atheist, you are under no obligation to claim that you are the best of creation and you have a spark of divinity. But as a theist, especially as a Muslim, you believe that you are the best of creation, created in the best possible way. And when you are compared with the animals like apes, it does create a problem. It does question that part where you were considered the best of creation.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I will briefly address that now. I would say it's just slightly separate to the core thing that we're talking about, but it is it's a related question, and that is, part of the whole religion and science debate, which is to say that what is our purpose in life, or why, if you believe in God, if you're a theist, why did God create the world the way He did, and why did He create us as human beings the way He did? And theists have an answer to that, as you said, best of creation, or created in the image of God, or whatever, created for a purpose, as trustees or stewards of God's creation, as Khalifa, vicegerent stewards. Stewardship is a better translation of Khalifa. And then, I had this debate at the Cheltenham Science Festival, I don't know, nearly 20 years ago, actually, where there was I was on a panel with Lord Robert Winston, who is another top British scientist. He's actually Jewish, so he's actually a believer. But we had a long debate with the audience as well. And for example, one of the audience members said, insects are more successful than human beings. There are billions and billions of insects, or more than billions, hundreds of billions. So in terms of numbers, they are the most successful living creatures. Why are we fixed on human beings? And I replied, I said, no, that's not true. Yeah, there are more insects, and there are many tiny species which are more in number than human beings. But I said insects have not produced great art or great literature, or traveled and explored across space and all of that. And as the Muslim scholars know and philosophers know, animals are stronger in many qualities. Human beings cannot compete with animals in many things. So, for example, we don't have the strength of elephants, or the speed of cheetahs or tigers, or the cunning of foxes, or the flight abilities of even the basic birds. The types. People have studied flight, the aerodynamics of what even flies or small birds do, let alone the great eagles and falcons and all the rest of it. Or the swimming abilities. Well, human being can swim, but the swimming abilities of the sharks and the whales and the fish in general. Birds flying from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere every year, migratory, and the way they navigate. All of these things are very well known, and it's fascinating in the world of biology. But none of those animals are ruling the world the way human beings are. Human beings have controlled and tamed basically all of those through our intelligence. And this is also a scientific fact, actually. And I know this as a physicist and mathematician, that we can measure the complexity of living organisms. This is well known. There's ways of mathematically determining or defining complexity, and have mathematical equations for it. And this is well known in modern science. The most complex object, basically, that we know of is the human brain. And living organisms are the most complex objects that we know of. So the physicists and astronomers, we study stars, but stars are actually quite simple. They're just hydrogen and helium atoms, basically. Protons and electrons fusing together. Plasma, hydrogen, helium. The sun's energy, all that immense energy, is through nuclear fusion of hydrogen atoms, which are just a proton and an electron, fusing two together become the helium atom and releases enormous amounts of energy. So the stars are huge, of course, humongous, massive, but they're actually quite simple in their structure. It is living systems that are much more complicated. Just look at a cell, any cell, and this is well known in biology. But then when the cells come together and organs come together, then it becomes more and more complex. And the most complex living organism and the most complex physical object that we know of in the entire universe is the human brain. So this is a scientific fact. And we know that is why human beings are so successful. So we are special. I mean, I would say to my atheist friends, and I have atheist friends, is that, well, how can you deny that we are the best of creation in many ways? It's a scientific fact that our brains are more complicated even than of our animal relatives. And that's why we see that. Just look at the earth. It is human beings shaping the earth, changing the environment, doing a lot of damage, but also a lot of good as well, actually, and looking after animals and others. And so, it's along those lines. I think the question you asked is a very, very important one. Thank you. And it's one which will continue, and there are many arenas in which to continue that discussion. It's possibly a topic for another podcast with myself or somebody else, as many people working in these areas, of course. It's a very important topic. And I think the more we study both religion and science, and religious or philosophical heritage, for example, the Islamic religious philosophical heritage in answering these questions, and we understand the science more, then we can continue that conversation, which is very fruitful. Yeah. But if that's all right, I'd like to go on to the just quickly looking at some of these objections. So I should have numbered these, okay? And because people say, well, it goes against the Quran, yeah? So here this is where people say human evolution contradicts the Quran. Therefore, Muslims, believing, practicing Orthodox Muslims cannot accept human evolution. And this is where I set out the objection and answer them one by one. And I say, look, if we look at the Quranic account, we know it is told many times the story. Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah Sa'd, Surah Al-Hijr. Many surahs mention the creation story, Surah Al-Araf. But it boils down to this, that these are the main points, I'd say, that Hazrat Adam was created from earth and water, or clay as well. God breathed his spirit into Adam's body. God taught Adam all the names. The angels did not know them. God taught eloquent speech to man, or to the human. Adam was a perfect man, and there was no young earth teaching. That's a separate question, because it's a big issue in fundamentalist Judaism and Christianity. The last point, it is an issue in Islam as well, but it's not a big issue. Okay, so I say revisited. Let's think about this again. Adam was created from earth and water and clay, the Quran says. Well, what does modern science say? It says life evolved from earth and water. And even asks the question, did life begin from clay? So, the very first molecules of life. Now, this is one of the top biology textbooks, certainly of the late 20th century and early 21st century, by Robert, Rice, and Munger. In their book, Advanced Biology, on page 761, they even favor the theory that life actually began from clay, because there's a particular feature of clay crystal, or the clay soils, which has shapes which allow for certain shaped molecules to form and connect together. And so, that's quite astonishing that they just said this on a purely scientific basis. Okay, but my point is that modern science says the same thing as the Quran, which is Adam was created from earth and water. Next thing is God breathed his spirit into Adam's body. Here I quote Ibn Arabi, who says that this refers to the intellectual and spiritual faculties reaching full maturity in humanity. This is similar to what Polkinghorne, another great British physicist, who is a Christian, a believing and practicing Christian, he wrote, human self-awareness is the greatest moment of history. So that moment of flowering, which is God breathing his spirit into Adam's body. And now here, I think I'll come back to this in another slide. This is one of the arguments or misconception which the other side say, that this is why we can't accept human evolution. They say because doesn't the Quran say that God created Adam separately and breathed his spirit into him? Well, Ibn Arabi's interpretation of that, it's very clear in the first chapter of his Bezels of Wisdom, the Fusus al-Hikam. He says that breathing of the spirit started with the beginning of creation. So if we accept the Big Bang model, so the universe is 13, 14 billion years old, whatever it is. As Professor Nidal Gesum has pointed out, if we map that to 1 year, if the history of the universe, if we map it to a human year to try to understand, then human beings do not appear until a second to midnight on the 31st of December. That's how late we are in the time span of the universe. Yeah, and so a lot of Muslims think, well, God breathed his spirit into Adam then, 1 second before midnight, the last second of the year, if you like. But what Ibn Arabi is saying, that this breathing of the spirit started with the first second of January the 1st, at the beginning of the year. And the whole thing of creation, that is God's spirit being breathed into the universe, and it reaches its culmination, it is completed with the full creation of Adam, because that is a moment of human self-awareness, which, as Jonathan Polkinghorne says, is the greatest moment of history. And now, then,
just to be clear, when God breathed his spirit, it was a gradual process. It did not happen overnight.
Exactly.
And when it reaches Adam, it reaches its immaculate maturity. That means that is the end of that process. Is that what Ibn Arabi is referring to?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Very well put. And I believe that this is how Muslims, because we have to take, all we know about modern science into account, as Muslims have always done, and they develop that. is that, this is a very fruitful way to think about it. And this is exactly what Ibn Arabi says, because Adam was a perfect man, al-insan al-kamil. And in fact, all of the great prophets were. And that is related to that next teaching, that God taught Adam all his names, which is in the Quran. So Adam was the first full human, if you like, the creation receptive to receiving full divine knowledge. So that's where, this is where, for a believer, a theist, a human, our conception differs from that of an atheist or materialist who just sees human being as a purely biological animal only. Whereas for us, it's biological plus spiritual. So we've already dealt with the biology. There's no doubt about the biology, basically, but we have to deal with understanding the spirit side of things. And this is how we, I believe, this is how we reconcile the two. So that's those last 2 points are related. God teaching Adam all the names. There are different interpretations of the names, but again, Ibn Arabi's interpretation is that God taught his names, God's names, God's most beautiful names, al-Asma al-Husna. That's what it means. He taught them to Adam. And so that is divine knowledge of God. That is the highest knowledge that the animals, in a sense, are aware of implicitly. They have a connection with the divine, but explicit knowledge of God and being able to talk about God and teach about God and receive revelation directly in the form of scripture, like the Quran, has only happened to humans for this reason. Right. Now I'll come into the objection. So, because basically my slide here, in my view, this just summarizes how you can reconcile the two stories, and there's no contradiction. But the next few slides actually just go through some of the so-called contradictions or objections in a bit more detail. So the first objection is that it wasn't Adam miraculous, because God said in the Quran that with God, Jesus is like Adam. He created him from dust, and then he said to him, be, and he was. So a lot of Muslims have this idea that, that it was overnight. What you asked earlier, that the breathing of the Spirit was overnight. Adam was just a lifeless statue made of clay. And then God breathed the Spirit into him and it said, be, and he was. And my answer to that is, and people quote this verse a lot, in this verse, Adam is compared to Jesus Christ, explicitly. That the Quran here affirms a gradual natural process for the virgin birth of Christ. So why not a natural process for Adam? Because you see in the Quran, the story of Jesus Christ in Surah Maryam, the chapter on Mary, it mentions labor pains, that Mary had labor pains, and that's why God sent the angel to tell her to pull on the branch of the palm tree, because holding on and pulling like that helps with labor pains. And the labor pains are mentioned explicitly. فَأَجَاءَهَا الْمَخَاضُ, they call مَخَاض, إِلَى جِذْعِ النَّخْلَةِ, the labor pain that drove her to the palm tree. And therefore the Quran affirms that, although the Quran says Jesus was created with the command kun fayakun, be, and he was, but that took a gradual natural process. It included 9 months, presumably roughly 9 months, in the womb of Hazrat Maryam, of Mary. So there's a gradual natural process there for Jesus. So why not for Adam as well? Okay, so this objection actually does not prove that that the Spirit was breathed overnight. And as we said, Ibn Arabi certainly did not understand it that way. And he was a master of Quran and Hadith, but also of kind of Sufi spiritual teachings. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is something, again, you referred to earlier, that it's not offensive. Surely the greatest men and women, such as Abraham, Moses, Musa, Mary, Maryam, Jesus Christ, Isa, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon them, could not have had common ancestors with apes. And so a lot of Muslims find this very offensive, that human evolution does teach, biology teaches that we, and that includes all the great prophets of God, are descended as with common ancestors with the apes. So we had common origins. And my answer to that is, well, humble origins is something affirmed by the Quran. The fact that human beings have reached the greatness of being the best of creation and receiving God's spirit, and the greatest prophets amongst them have reached incredible heights. It does not contradict the fact that we have humble origin, because the Quran repeatedly refers to that. For example, God says in the Quran repeatedly that we created human beings from a despised drops of water, despised, hated, contemptible, ma'in mahin. So we all have that despised origin, if you like, which is what the Quran says. So again, there's no contradiction there. The third argument people using, perhaps this is the one driving most strongly this idea of Adamic exceptionalism, etc., is the story of the fall, meaning the fall from grace, or the fall from heaven, from the garden. In the Quranic story, after Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree, they were expelled from the garden and sent down to earth. Now, here, so this is why, in my view, this is the single biggest reasons why a lot of Muslims do not accept human evolution, because in their mind, Adam and Eve were created in heaven, in paradise, in a different realm, and then you had the story of the forbidden tree, and then they were sent down to earth, and so they appeared fully formed already on earth, so they can't have evolved on earth. And so, my answer, what I would ask them is, if we had a video camera on earth which recorded the entire human history, what would you see if you replayed it back? In the minds of many, probably most Muslim colleagues, they would imagine that Adam and Eve suddenly appeared out of nowhere on one place on earth somewhere, either Sri Lanka or Arabia. There are many different traditions, Sri Lanka or India or Arabia, and because they came down to earth from heaven. And so, that picture is understandable, it's logical, if you believe Adam and Eve were in a separate realm called heaven. However, something very well known to scholars of the Quran is that the word for the story, it happened in Jannah, the garden. The Quranic garden Jannah refers both to gardens in heaven but also on earth as well. This is the story of Ashabul Jannah, the people of the garden, in Surah Al-Qalam, the pen, is entirely on this earth. The Quran speaks about gardens with rivers in this world, on the earth, as well as in heaven. So the garden of Adam and Eve, was it on this earth? Was it earthly? Or was it in heaven? That's a crucial question here. By the way, most Jews and Christians believe it is on earth. The Garden of Eden was on earth. I was just reading yesterday how many Jews believe it might be in Sinai, close to Mount Sinai. Many others believe it was in Sri Lanka. There are others who believe it was in Arabia, including in the Muslim world. So Aden, one of the former capitals of Yemen, Aden, as Aden, is the same word exactly of Jannah to Aden, Garden of Eden. It is named Aden because there is a legend that this was where the Garden of Eden was. It was on earth, Adam and Eve. The other view is Muscat, the capital of Oman. Muscat means a place where somebody falls. So Muscat is named Muscat because there is a legend saying that when Adam and Eve were expelled from the heavenly garden, they fell onto the earth in that place, Muscat, the place of the fall. And that's why it's called Muscat. And by the way, related to these legends in Arabia, you probably know that Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia, the word Jeddah means grandmother. The reason it's named grandmother, there's a legend is that Hazrat Hawa, Eve, is buried in the desert near Jeddah, which is where that name comes from. So anyway, you have these legends, but what a lot of people don't know, but any student of tafsir, of the commentary of the Quran, will know, is that some of the early commentators in the Quran believe that Adam's garden was on the earth. Both Tabari and Ibn Kathir refer to this difference of opinion. Ibn al-Qayyim as well, by the way, writes dozens of pages giving both viewpoints. And I say here something which I believe is very important, is that because all the evidence points to evolution, this is an example of where modern science can settle a difference of opinion about interpretation of the Quran. So I believe that once you accept this, human evolution applies that the Garden of Eden was on earth, not in paradise, not in heaven. Remember, there's two views on this, right from early Islam. Most Jews and Christians take the same view, that the Garden of Eden, the story of Adam and Eve, was on the earth. And I believe that human evolution points to that, because otherwise you have to believe that Adam and Eve appeared on the earth fully formed already, and they can't have evolved on the earth. And I believe, because the other side who are talking about Adamic exceptionalism and other such theories, I believe they've not understood this. And I've not seen any of them grapple with this, even though myself and others have published about this. And they're saying, oh, traditional beliefs. The traditional beliefs is about Adam and Eve being in heaven. Well, and we have to hold that alongside modern science, and therefore they come up with this idea of Adam's case being special, for which there's no evidence, basically, and also all the evidence points against it. So they're rejecting the clear science because of a religious argument, which is actually easily solved with this, and it's nothing new. It's part of the Islamic tradition. The earliest tradition, you had Muslim commentators. They were a minority in the early times, but truth is not judged by majority or minority. It's by the evidence. But it's there in the Islamic tradition that the whole story of Adam and Eve, the creation and the fall, all happen on the earth. And I believe that modern science points very strongly to that. Are you familiar with the Adamic exceptionalism and the arguments?
Yes, sir.
Muslim
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Yes, I am. Okay, so that there's one more objection, and this is a very common objection among the theists, and it is related to that specific ayah from the Quran, "Fi ahsani taqweem," that we are the best of creation, which means we were perfect. So Richard Dawkins and majority of the evolutionary biologists, they believe that human anatomy is defective. It's not perfect. There are some things that are not perfect. So they believe that this directly clashes with our core belief that when God created us, we were perfect. There was no defect in human anatomy, but evolution says otherwise.
That's a really good question, actually, which thank you for that. I will add this to a future version of my paper, actually, because of my paper and presentation, because I don't actually address that one specifically. In fact, I actually just lectured on Surah Al-Tin yesterday, so I was looking at those verses, and I will share the YouTube video with you later. Just published that 2 hours ago, actually. But لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ السَّافِلِينَ. Yeah, as you said, God said we created the human being in the best structure, and then we reduced him to the lowest of the low. Well, the point there is there are many different there are at least 3 different interpretations of even what that verse means. What does the best of constitutions or structures mean? And nobody has really ever claimed, no Muslim scholar, that we are physically perfect in every way, because people can see defects and imperfections and the diversity across human beings. For example, there are still pygmies, very short people, only 2 or 3 foot tall. Human pygmies still exist in Africa and other parts of the world. I was born in Africa. I'm old enough to remember seeing pygmies in our safari journeys in Kenya, where I was born. And secondly, the best. So there we have interpretations given by the authorities where they may not have been aware of. Okay, they weren't aware of the later field of science, etc. So some of the early Quran authorities said that human beings are the only one who stand and walk upright on 2 feet. All other animals are on all fours, or they slide on their belly, etc. And we know that's not true. There are other bipedal apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, and others who can also stand on 2 feet. But the vast majority of animals, it is true that they walk on all fours, or they crawl, etc., or they have many legs like the insects. And it is human beings who are the most upright. But again, the ultimate meaning of that is very spiritual, is that the best structure or constitution, the best form, is that of Adam alayhi salam being able to know the names of God and being able to receive revelation. And then, you see, reducing to the lowest of the low. Because what does that mean? If ahsani taqweem means perfect creation, what does asfala safilin mean? Lowest of the low. So actually, those who took that view, they said lowest of the low means infirm old age with dementia, etc. That's a classical tafsir. But there's another view which is no, it's a moral lowest of the low. This is all moral. Ahsan al-Taqweem is a moral picture. The human being were created, as we've already said, at the highest perfect stage of morality, being able to tell between good and evil, like the angels. But then we're reduced to asfala safilin, the lowest of the low, meaning they can be worse than the animals and savage and wild and all the evil that is done by humans in the world, and that's what takes them to the fire. So that would be my answer to that. It is a moral and spiritual ahsan taqweem, which then becomes asfala safilin, or can become asfala safilin. So that's the human potential, right? And this is a matter of spirituality and religion, not really science. Is that human beings are capable of the most loving, wonderful, selfless achievements, but also capable of the worst evil, as we see with all the fighting and killing and conflict in the world. So we're back to religion and science. So actually, I've dealt with the main objection. For me, the main objection is number 3, and the whole all these academic papers now, based on the original view number 2, talking about Adamic exceptionalism. And I believe this slide just demolishes the whole idea of Adamic exceptionalism. And I would invite those Muslim academics who, I know some of them, they're about my age or younger. In my view, they have not engaged with this. And I have written about this in my paper. I need to write more. I've given the quotes from Ibn Kathir. I think I might have to add Tabari, I can't remember. Ibn al-Qayyim wrote dozens of pages giving the 2 views as to whether the Garden of Eden is on the earth or in heaven. And to me, that solves it. But people would, number 1, have to accept that. Number 2, they'd have to accept my last line here, which they might find difficult, which is modern science settling a question of tafsir. But that's not a new idea, because I gave a list of many other examples later, which I'll very quickly come to. This one we've already dealt with, sorry. The next objection of the theory of evolution leads to atheism, doesn't it? My answer is no. More than 99% of US scientists accept human evolution, and 40% of US scientists believe in God. So these are the stats. So, okay, that means 60% of US scientists do not believe in God, okay? It's very common for scientists to be atheist, and more so probably in Western Europe, a kind of stronger tradition of atheism here. But I haven't even talked about other parts of the world, India, Asia, Africa, India, Pakistan, should I say, the Muslim world, where very high numbers of scientists do believe in God, much higher than this. And this is part of the science versus religion debate. And the basics are always very simple in my view. Science tells us how we were created. Revelation tells us why we were created. So the science, and we know how advanced it is, all the biology, DNA, all of this stuff, the Big Bang, even before that, evolution of life on Earth. This is all how. It's fascinating. It's brilliant. God, Allah, has given us the capability to learn all this over the last few thousands of years of human endeavor. But it says nothing about why. Why were we created? That's the story of Adam, the perfect man, al-insan al-kamil.
And this is what I say when I'm discussing this subject with my students, that you have to respect science, because it only unravels the majesty of God.
Yes, exactly. So just to give you some background, when I talked about this publicly for the first time from about 2008 to 2011, it actually caused a bit of a stir in the Muslim community in Britain, actually around the world. And we had that debate in 2013, it was, the big evolution debate, where there was myself, Professor Ihab Abu Haif, and Professor Fatima Jackson, all arguing for this side of things. And on the other side, we had one of Harun Yahya's students. His name was Dr. Haruna Babuna, who is also in jail now for a very long time. He was part of that plot, or that terrible behavior. And on the other side was also Yasir Qadi, and I can't remember who the third person was actually. But Dr. Haruna Babana took the Harun Yahya's view, so number 1. Yasir Qadi was taking number 2, so accepting all of evolution but not human evolution. And the 3 of us on this side of the debate, 2013, the YouTube videos are there, were taking position number 3, which I've been arguing for since 2008 actually, publicly. Now, just on that, as a scientist, by the grace of God, I've been trained as a scientist and an Imam Sahib, and I'm passionate about both. like promoting both religion and science. So I'm very glad that you said and that you teach your students to respect science. Not more of that, but it reveals the majesty of God's creation. Oh, related to that, a top British BBC TV presenter got in touch with me because he saw some of the news coverage. This was covered by the BBC and CNN and other people around the world. And he told me that as a young man, he grew up in a Christian household, but like many young Western people, he lost his faith and he was away from religion, basically an atheist. And then he got very interested in evolution and biology because it is fascinating. And he told me that studying evolution, which he knows a lot about, had brought him back to faith. So he discovered the majesty of God, actually. It went the other way. And I know many examples like that. People often think, oh my gosh, evolution is going to, if we accept evolution, then people are going to lose their faith. I know many cases where it works the other way. Those who can see the majesty of God in science. I mean, I see that in physics, the Big Bang, relativity, quantum theory, phenomenal stuff. We see it in mathematics, which is based on Tawheed, by the way, the oneness of God, but properly understood. But biologists know better the miracles that they see in the human body and animal body and the whole evolution process. How elephants have evolved many different times, how the whale is a mammal because the birds, the life, developed in the sea to a large extent, hence your grandmother fish or your inner fish. And then some of those fish came out onto land and became amphibians, and eventually they evolved into land animals and birds and all the rest of it. But then some of the mammals then went back into the sea. That's where the whale is. It started as a fish, it evolved into a mammal on land, and then went back into the sea. And and there are thousands of millions of examples. And so I'll give that example. There's a top BBC presenter. I can't mention his name because this was a private conversation, but he's very well known in Britain. And he told me, we're still in touch, and we discussed these things about religion and science, especially evolution, that evolution brought him back to faith, actually, because he saw the majesty of God in it, which is related to my next slide, which is that many young Muslims have lost their faith after studying science. And in my view, this is a big problem if we don't address this issue. Because what happens is that evolution is basic biology. As I said before, to say evolution is wrong is like saying gravity is wrong in physics. Okay, and anybody who studies basic biology, GCSE and A-level, they know it's a fact. I should say fact here. And I would claim that thousands of young Muslims around the world have become an atheist or agnostic after studying biology or after being told that the Quran contradicts modern science. And one of them told me this. They knew biology from school. They went to mosque and they heard the Imam Sahib saying that evolution is wrong and it's against the Quran. It contradicts the Quran. And he basically said, well, I know from all the science that evolution is correct. So if it contradicts the Quran, then the Quran must be wrong. God forbid, yeah? And because a person didn't have a strong grounding in Quran, which by the grace of God I did, and completing hifz. So, and many people like that, a lot of Muslims who have not studied the Quran, of course, and certainly not in the original language or in translation. They might have read it Nazara, but without understanding the meaning because they haven't read the translation or they don't know the Arabic. This is very common, unfortunately. I know people personally have helped to rediscover their faith by reconciling biology with the Quran. So with the arguments that I've used, there are a number of young people in Britain who, by the grace of God, alhamdulillah, they've thanked me. They thank Allah, it all comes from Allah. But they have said, thank you, you've helped us keep our faith or rediscover our faith or come back to faith because we thought that the Quran was incompatible with evolution and they knew evolution to be basic scientific fact, so they lost their faith. But once they've seen that you can reconcile the two and all of the objections can be addressed, then there's no reason to reject the Quran or to lose their faith. But then you do have the extreme on the other side, which is we had the famous cases of university students, Muslim university students, top universities in Britain, walk out of biology lectures, which is a huge disaster, actually. But again, that's being addressed and the situation is improving. Now, just very quickly, there were just a couple more important arguments I wish to get across, and I'm conscious of the time here. But just to know that this is I'm not the only person saying this, and perhaps a minority of people, but here is a list of post-Darwin Muslim scholars who accepted evolution fully or partially. And so these include Islamic scholars and others. These are mainly Islamic scholars. Theologian, Dr. Muhammad Hamidullah, I mentioned, Allama Iqbal, Professor Fazlur Rahman, the famous thinker, Dr. Isar Ahmed. He published in detail on this after his death. He wrote the famous Dr. Isar Ahmed of Lahore. He'd written a very long piece on this. I think, he accepts, I say fully or partially, is probably partial, but surprisingly to a great extent. But he gave instruction that this was not to be published because he knew the controversy it would cause. It was published after his death. Sayyid Sulaiman al-Nadwi. These are all originally from India, Pakistan, the Indian subcontinent, from the Barr Saghir. But now you have some Arab scholars, and these were top Arab scholars of the 20th century from Al-Azhar and other places. Sheikh Nadim al-Jisr and his son Sheikh Hassan or Hussein, it might have been al-Jisr. There was Abdus Sabur Shaheen, who was one of the top scholars of Al-Azhar in Egypt, and I'll come on to that. Those are the Islamic scholars. These are Muslim scientists. I've mentioned my friend and colleague, Professor Nidal Gassoum, who wrote Islam's Quantum Question and also A Young Muslim's Guide to Modern Science. Dr. Shanavaz, Professor Fatima Jackson, Ihab Abu Hayf, I mentioned, Dr. Salman Hamid, Professor Ziauddin Sardar, and many others. We could have a much longer list, actually. Now, just a couple of interesting things. There are Islamic tradition on Adam alayhi salam, so we have to also recognize that there are wider ideas about Adam alayhi salam, which are part of the Islamic tradition. And actually, one of these is from Jaladul's book. Anyway, but especially from Ahlul Bayt. So Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, it is attributed to him that he said, before the Adam who is our father, 1 million Adams or more had passed from existence. He said this. His son, Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, said, perhaps you think that God never created a human being other than yourselves. Nay, but God created 1 million Adams, and you are the last of those Adams. Now, these are both in the famous 20th century tafsir by the Iraqi great scholar Alusi. That's his commentary on the Quran, Ruh al-Ma'ani, Spirit of the Meanings. Now we don't know exactly what they mean or what they meant, but we can only interpret them from our lens. And my interpretation is they're actually talking about the hominid species, because we know, as one writer put it, I think Richard Leakey, if you look at the history of human evolution and how long it took, if you piled up the ancestors, each generation in a coffin, then the number of generations you need is so big. I think the pile of coffins would stretch to the moon or something. He gives an image like that. I mean, it took a long time. But here we have the Ahlul Bayt saying you had 1 million or more Adams before our Adam. Ibn Arabi dropped to zero. He said Allah created 100,000 Adams, okay, which I found amusing. He also said, this is in his Futuhat Makkiyah, he said, at the Kaaba, I met and spoke to a man, a Rajul, who was not from Bani Adam, which is an extraordinary thing he said. And so that just draws up question, what's he talking about? Ibn Arabi has extraordinary stories, because he was an extraordinary person in his spiritual experiences. But this is what he says. Physically at the Kaaba, while doing Tawaf, he met and spoke to a man who was not from the Bani Adam, but he was a man, a Rajul. So that implies, another hominid species, if you like. So this is part of the Islamic tradition. I say this to those who say, oh, no, we must protect traditional Islamic beliefs. Well, hold on. These are traditional Islamic beliefs. You know what happened to all of this? Okay, I've already talked about this, human being being animal and angel, okay? And I would say that biology deals with the animal side and religion deals with our spiritual side, our angel side. This is the one confusion that people have to get clear, that there is no contradiction between the two. By accepting the biology, we are looking at the physical, scientific, biological side of things. That's our animal self, which all the Muslim scholars have accepted. We are animals, but we are all partly animals. We are also partly angels. And the religious and spiritual teachings are dealing with the angelic side. And actually, again, Ibn Arabi relates that to the teaching where God says, I created Adam with my 2 hands. The 2 hands has many different meanings, the inner and the outer, and that's related to this. inner and the outer. Our outer form is biological, like an animal. Our inner form is like an angel, the spirituality. So I'm not going to read all those points, but I'll come back to Dr. Abdul Sabur Shaheen. He wrote a famous book in Egypt about the creation of humanity, and he mentioned about the Lucy fossil and talked about that in great detail. He called it Abi Adam, my father Adam. Okay, it's called The Story of Creation Between Fable or Legend and Reality. Famous book. He analyzed 35 verses of the Quran about the creation of Al-Bashar, a prominent creation, or Al-Insan, humanity, in order of revelation. Those are the full references. And this was his conclusion. He said this process took millions of years. Humanity, Insan, emerged from the essence of Al-Bashar. Creation became perfect and Adam appeared. It is not far-fetched for us to imagine that Adam was born of two parents, as was Eve, even though this concept will meet immediate opposition and violent rejection without thinking. So he actually said that Adam and Eve had parents. So, accepting what human biology says. And this is a top scholar of Al-Azhar in Egypt, Sheikh Abdul Sabur Shaheen. He was the Imam of the oldest mosque in Egypt, the Masjid of Amr ibn al-As. It's a very historic mosque in Cairo. So, we're talking about a very, very top Imam and Sheikh in Egypt who wrote this, which you can imagine. It's quite extraordinary. Before him, Sheikh Rashid Rida had mentioned that the Hindus believe that Adam, the first man, or who they call Manu, had a mother, and they have two adjacent domed shrines in the sacred city of Banaras. That's an al-Manar, tafsir al-Manar, that Adam had parents. So Abdul Sabur Shaheen actually said Adam and Eve may have had parents, and this will be shocking to people, but this is what the evidence points to. This is a top Islamic scholar saying this in the 20th century. What's interesting is Al-Azhar, this did create a stir. Al-Azhar discussed his book, that whole committee, and they issued a fatwa on it, which is printed at the end of the book. And their conclusion was, we disagree with his interpretations, his ta'wil, but these do not exceed the limit. They said this is not outside the pale of Islam. This is like an ijtihad. This is his understanding. And as a qualified Islamic scholar, he's given his argument from the Quran and from the science. He's discussed the fossil of Lucy and all the rest of it. By the way, he made some mistakes on the scientific side because he wasn't a scientist. But it was a very good effort because very few Islamic scholars have had the courage to actually grapple with those topics. But he looked at the interpretation of the Quran. And Al-Azhar agreed that it might be a different view, but it wasn't kufr, it wasn't outside the pale of Islam. And that fatwa was published in 1999. It was written by the son of the famous Quran commentator, Sheikh Muhammad Mutawalli al-Sha'rawi, who is very well known. His son is also a Sheikh and Islamic scholar. His name is Sami. So, we have the top Al-Azhar authorities saying, well, we disagree, but, this is within the pale of Islam. This is fair enough if somebody has that interpretation. This is what Hassan al-Jassar and his son, Nadim al-Jassar, I think, and his son Hassan Hussein al-Jassar, they said the most important thing is to realize that if evolution theory is proved, then that means this is how God created human beings. So I'll summarize it by saying God created us via evolution. It's not a dichotomy. It's not a binary or dilemma that did we come about through evolution or did God create us? Which one is it? Is it creationism or evolutionism? That's a false binary. That did we evolve or did God create us? The answer is both. God created us through evolution. Yeah, I think that's a very clear answer, which I should state somewhere. God created us through evolution, via evolution. And this is what this Sheikh said. Even Al-Qaradawi, Sheikh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi famously said that if evolution theory is proven, then we will find interpretation of the Quran which accord with that, because you cannot challenge established scientific fact. So, there's certainly room for this acceptance, and I believe in the future Muslims will, through a process of debate, dialogue, etc., will actually come to a common view on this, and they will accept the science as well as religious interpretations and reconcile the two. And now I said that my understanding is, based on all of this, we can decide on the religious question or the belief as to whether the Garden of Eden of Adam and Eve was on this earth or in heaven. And I say the science settled the question. It was on earth. And some people might think, oh, you can't do that. But my answer is, yes, you can. And that has always happened in the interpretation of the Quran. So, for example, which was created the first, the heaven or the earth? My grand Sheikh Shanqiti, who's a great Quran scholar, discusses this topic. And I think it's very clear from the science what the answer is. Is the earth flat or round? Now, Imam Suyuti said the earth is flat in his commentary on the Quran based on a Quranic verse. But interestingly, he said that the Muslim astronomers say it is round. And then he said, but this is not a principle of faith. It doesn't really matter whether you believe the earth is round or flat. He says that the Islamic scholar, the religious scholars believe it's flat, based on verses like God has spread the earth out like a carpet. But he says the Muslim astronomers say it's round, but he says it's not a big deal. Okay, does the earth go around the sun or vice versa? This is the famous issue of the Copernican revolution, right? Before Copernicus and Galileo, a lot of people believe that the sun and moon and stars, they revolve around the earth. And a lot of Muslims, that was everybody, Jews, Christians, Muslims, everybody believed that in the medieval period. And many commentaries on the Quran just assume that. But after Copernicus and Galileo, and before that, the Muslim astronomers like Muhammad al-Battani and Ibn Shatir had developed models because the observation didn't fit the old model, and they didn't get to, as far as they didn't get to what Copernicus and Galileo came out with, but they were working on that. There's no doubt the Muslim astronomers were aware of the problems of the old geocentric model where everything revolves around the earth, and given enough time or opportunity or the invention of the telescope, they would have got there, you would have thought. Does the moon really cause a solar eclipse? You see, part of this discussing with religious people is often religious scholars. So one of the great hadith scholars did not accept, when he's discussing the eclipse prayer, he actually says that you scientists, you Muslim astronomer scientists, you say that the sun is much, much, much bigger than the moon, but yet you also say that the moon completely blocks the sun at the eclipse, solar eclipse. How is that possible? Because he basically didn't understand perspective. Imam Suyuti himself said he was a polymath, a master of Quran, Hadith, history, or many subjects. But he himself wrote in his autobiography, he said, the one subject I could never understand was mathematics. He said, if you asked me to move a mountain, that would be easier than to be good at hisab, mathematics. So if our religious scholars do not understand the basics of mathematics or astronomy, then of course they will find it difficult to accept some scientific realities. For example, here's a great hadith scholar who could not accept that the moon could block out the sun, because he said, well, the sun is much, much bigger than the moon. Okay, are we created from men and women's fluids or men's fluids only? You see, Aristotle, the medieval world just followed Aristotle, which is to say that a human being is created from the sperm only, from the male fluid only. And so you find that in commentaries on the Quran, Surah Al-Tariq. But actually, funnily enough, the hadith mention men's and women's fluids, and we know nobody seriously argues with this anymore. So all the latest commentary of the Quran will explain those verses differently. There is a different interpretation to those verses of Surah Al-Tariq, where it's the creation of the human being is from men and women's fluids. And I wrote about this in a long article for The Guardian, actually. I covered most of these issues, I think all of them. For The Guardian back in 2008. So again, science has settled this. No serious Quran scholar would quote Aristotle now, whose view was that the sperm cell has a tiny copy of a man in there, and only the sperm cell has it, the ovum doesn't. And that's why we are created from the male fluid only. Nobody seriously believes that. We know about DNA, we know about X and Y chromosomes, we know that every child takes half their genes from their mother and half from their father, and the 23 pairs of chromosomes mix in unique ways for each different child, because there are millions of combinations. And this is all basic science now. And so science had actually settled all of these questions, which were addressed in commentaries of the Quran. And the one I've added, I just believe, is another one. It's just another one added to a long list. I've nearly finished, and then we can. Okay, I've already covered that one. Oh, I like this. I learned this from my father-in-law, the late departed Professor Khurshid Ahmed of Islamabad. He taught me this from Akbar al-Lahabadi. As you know, Akbar al-Lahabadi was a famous satirical poet, and he compared Hallaj, the 10th century Sufi of Baghdad, who was crucified for saying "An al-Haq," I'm the truth. He compared him with Darwin, and apologies for my Urdu, I will break into Urdu. It went something like this: Hallaj ne kaha मैं खुदा हूँ, Darwin ने कहा मैं बंदर था, सब अपनी 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 हिम्मत के मुताबिक. So
इसी के एक बड़ी फेमस मीम है कि वो वुमेन कहती है कि वी इवॉल्व फ्रॉम एप्स मंकीज, और वो फादर को कहती है कि फादर ने तो कहा था कि नहीं, ऐसा पॉसिबल नहीं है. तो फादर कहता है कि इसकी जो फैमिली की साइड है ना, वो बंदरों से इवॉल्व की थी, हमें गॉड ने बनाया था.
Very good, thank you for that. I wasn't aware of that variation, but I love this from Akbar al-Lahabadi. In fact, I quoted this on the BBC. They loved it when I spoke about this on Thought for the Day, where you have 3 minutes to present. I quoted this, and the BBC absolutely loved it. Hallaj said, "I am God." Darwin said, "I was an ape," each according to his aspirations. So I was really dissing a great British scientist, saying, "Well, that's his aspiration." And I have some recommended reading here. There's probably many others on this topic, including the bottom, any good book on evolution for the biology. But there are many other writings on this. And so to summarize, science tells us how we were created. Religion tells us why we were created and what our moral purpose is in life, and it's very important. And secondly, to answer the question of evolution or creation, my answer is just very simple. We have to reconcile the two and say that God created us via evolution. It's really as simple as that. But we do have to answer a lot of objections and questions which this brings up other questions. Like did Hazrat Adam have parents? I already mentioned, there's a slide on that, top scholar of Al-Azhar already said it, and that this is what the science leads to. What I say is, look, this is not a matter of belief, iman or aqidah. It's a matter of tafsir and science. And Al-Azhar, by the way, Al-Azhar didn't agree with what Sheikh Shaheen said, but they said this is not outside the pale. They said it's an acceptable ijtihad, basically. It's an acceptable, this is his understanding, which is valid, and he has the right to, as a qualified Islamic scholar who's also studied science, to come up with, that's his conclusion, then he has every right to it. So there is room for that within the diversity of Muslim belief. Because as you know, in every topic, Muslims have had great diversity from the beginning. It is a great strength of the Islamic tradition and history. The great Muslim civilization were based on openness. No great civilization is based on narrow-minded groupthink or forcing people to think another way. You have to have a freedom of expression, of thought, of being able to explore new ideas, to test and experiment and observe. It's all part of the scientific method. But to test ideas and discard the ones that are proved wrong and accept the ones that are proved right. So in conclusion, that's where we are. And I think perhaps that is a good paragraph, actually, that God created us via evolution. I'll stop there for now. That's the end of my presentation, and I hope it has sparked lots of questions, which maybe, depending on how much time we have now, we can continue the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. So one comment that I have, this is one of the most sensitive and controversial topics, and there are lots of controversial and sensitive topics that humans have to grapple with. But there was a quote by Sir Francis Bacon that I really loved, and I'm paraphrasing him. He said, "Listen not to contradict, but to weigh and consider." So when you are listening to the opposing side, you just have to have this faith that you are trying to pursue the truth. It's the pursuit of truth. So wherever it leads you. So when it comes to telling the why, science is solving the how problem. I remember there were some colleagues of mine who were hardcore atheists, and then they studied science and fine-tuning argument, and they said, because of this fine-tuning argument, we are compelled to believe that there is a creator. And then there was another journey
Amazing.
when they had to decide. Yeah, the fine-tuning argument. They believe that is most of the people who engage in such debates, they believe fine-tuning argument is the most compelling, the strongest argument for the existence of God. And without science, we do not have this argument.
Yeah, of course. And I must admit, from a physicist background, I'm familiar with the fine-tuning argument, and as you know, the related anthropic principle, and there's a weak and a strong form of that. Actually, I won't actually comment because I go with the Quranic phrase, "Afillahi shak." Is there any doubt about God? For me, there's just no doubt about God whatsoever, as top Western philosophers have said as well. And actually, nothing makes sense at all without a creator or without a principle. Whatever you believe in, there has to be some principle where that comes from. This is what I asked Richard Dawkins, by the way. He said the universe, we don't need to posit a supernatural intelligence. He said, this is what he said to me. I can share this. I know he wouldn't mind private conversation. And because I asked him, he said the universe is built on the laws of science. We don't have to believe in God. I asked him, where do the laws of science come from? The laws of science are highly precise and beautiful. We physicists know that it's all built on mathematics, and the biologists know the majesty of the living world. Where do the laws of science come from? And actually, Dawkins said to me, his reply to that was he didn't have an answer. He said, I don't know. He said, I don't know, but he said, I don't have to posit a supernatural intelligence to explain it. Okay, that's where he was at. This was 15 odd years ago.
He was publicly asked this question. I guess he was asked to answer a similar question by Brian Greene, and he said, I can accept that, but that would undermine the scientific enterprise. Therefore, no God.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Yeah, because I know he's asked a similar question. So thank you for the quote from Brian Greene, who's a physicist, or his answer to that. But see, that's where I say, unfortunately, if Professor Dawkins knew better about the depth of religion and spirituality, and some of the teaching that we've mentioned from Rumi and Ibn Arabi, Allama Iqbal, and people like that, who find it very easy, and the Shaheen, Jisr, and others, who find it very easy to reconcile the two, then I hope he would one day understand that no, you don't have to give up the scientific enterprise. In fact, historically, all of the great scientists in the Muslim and Christian period, and before that, Aristotle, were all believers in God. So it's actually very flawed what Dawkins is saying. Aristotle is famous for his arguments as to why God exists, and then all the great Muslim scientists, Ibn Sina, al-Bayruni, they were Hafiz of Quran and stuff, and their science was inspired by the Quran. The great Christian scientist Copernicus, we mentioned, he was a bishop. Galileo was a devout Christian. Isaac Newton was a devout Christian and rejected the Trinity. He was a Unitarian Christian. That's a very strong monotheist. Even Darwin, there's books written on, he had a complex relationship with his faith. But there was faith. It's not very clear cut, actually. He wasn't, if you like, a pure theist, it seems, or pure atheist. He had a bit of a journey. But what Dawkins is saying is simply not true, that belief in God undermines science, because there are millions of good scientists, Nobel Prize winners. You think of Professor Abdus Salam of Pakistan, or the American Syrian chemist who recently won the Nobel Prize, and others who are believers in God. So, unfortunately, I think because Dawkins and others are not able to answer the real philosophical, theological questions, they divert with a red herring. That's a red herring for me to say, it undermines science. Another example is Lawrence Krauss, Universe from Nothing. He wrote his whole book. This is probably a separate podcast again, but, a universe from nothing is just based on the basic idea of quantum physics, of the uncertainty principle, where a particle can borrow energy as long as they give it back within a certain time, because energy and time are one of those pairs we have uncertainty together. And if the total energy of the universe is zero, then they can borrow almost an infinite amount of time. And that's the whole argument is based on that, to say you don't need God because you can get a universe out of nothing. But hold on, I replied to that in one tweet, which is that equation, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, is not nothing. It requires 20 years of advanced mathematics to study. We studied it, it's what you study in physics undergrad at university with all these quantum operators and very advanced mathematics. And that's a principle that exists. Where did that come from? It's not nothing, So this is why I say I've had lots of discussion with top scientists on these, and I always find that their grasp of philosophy and certainly theology is very, very poor. They often have this kind of arrogance that they know it all because they know all the science, and they can just dismiss any argument which they're not familiar with. And but as you said, you have to have humility. We have to have humility and debate with patience. And thank you for what you said earlier, which is very important. You said the humility of seeking the truth. And I believe that in both religion and science, that is one of the many things that unites both disciplines, if you like, is that we must have humility and be open to learning and increase our knowledge and admit our mistakes and say, look, I used to believe or think this, but now these arguments or this evidence has proved me wrong, so I no longer believe it, and I was wrong, and now I believe something better. That is a hallmark of true religion and true scientist or true science. Both of them are done like that. Yeah.
You mentioned Lawrence Krauss. You must have watched his debate with Hamza Zorzits, and when he was having his say on this particular topic, he was very arrogant, as you said, no humility whatsoever. And then because he was weak in philosophy, and Hamza Zorzits, he deliberately exposed that. He didn't even know the difference between deduction and induction. So that is why you have to have intellectual humility. You could be you could have an expertise on one subject, but it doesn't mean that you know everything. You cannot be Mr. Know-it-all. So, Dr. Usama, this discussion, it will continue. We both love this subject, so it has to end somewhere. And I guess this is the right moment to end it. There's only one question that I would like you to address, and that would be the end of this podcast. Imagine Imam al-Ghazali, he was living in this era. Ibn Taymiyyah, he was living in this era. Would they believe in evolution, or would they try to debunk it?
So very quickly, so Hamza Georges is an old friend of mine. I know him in this country. I actually never watched the debate because I felt I didn't need to. I replied to Krauss's argument in a tweet. It's that simple. And I hope to write on that. I should just expand it. Actually, that tweet is enough, 140 characters. But I should expand it into just 1 or 2 pages. I hope to do that. Now, on your second question, I don't believe we can put words into people's mouths. And one of my criticism of the Muslim academics talking about Adamic exceptionalism, some of them are claiming that this is the view of Imam Ghazali, or they're saying this is based on Imam Ghazali's formulation. And in my view, they're not being sincere or honest. They're actually hiding behind Imam Ghazali, and because he was Ash'ari, and they have a particular interpretation of Ash'ari philosophy, of which there are many interpretations, and they're saying this is what it leads to. In my view, they're not defending their own thesis as such and having the courage to do that. They're kind of hiding behind Imam Ghazali, saying, oh, this is a Ghazalian perspective. And I think that's actually very unfair and not an honest way for truth-seeking Muslims, seeking truth in religion and science, to proceed. What we can say, there's no doubt these were great spiritual people and people of great minds, and they made huge contributions to philosophy, theology, and the study of the Islamic sciences. Something I mentioned there, just those 2 names you mentioned, Imam Ghazali and Imam Taymiyyah, both of them, by the way, agreed that you couldn't prove the existence of God rationally or logically. I actually take that position as well. As you know, Aristotle had a different view. He believed you could prove God logically or rationally. But if you take the view that God transcends logic, you see, rationality, then there's no way from within rationality you can jump outside. The most you can do is say we come to the limits of rationality or logic, and we don't know what's beyond. But anyway, that's a different philosophical question. But to answer your question, what I would say is that my firm belief, not only of Imam Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, but also the great Muslim scientists I mentioned, Ibn Sina, Biruni, and others, if presented with the evidence, because all of them said you follow the evidence, and you must be willing to change your views and accept the truth. As Imam Shafi famously said, also Imam Shafi was famous for debating, but he said in a debate, he said, I would pray that God manifests the truth on the tongue of my opponent. He said the point of debate is not to win an argument. It's not like a boxing match, that when you're in a debate, you have to win. And therefore you use false arguments or arrogance to dismiss the other side. Imam Shafi said, the purpose of a debate is to arrive at the truth together. And he said, I pray that God manifests the truth on the tongue of my opponent, and that therefore I will then accept it, because the important thing is for the truth to come out. So I believe that all of these great minds and hearts and personalities, if presented with the evidence, then they would make their independent judgment of this. And if we're right, there's a debate at the moment, right, within the Muslim world. And I mentioned at least three possibilities. The first one is very discredited, and its main people are in prison in Turkey, very long prison sentences. In my mind, at the moment, the debate is between numbers 2 and 3 that I put on my first slide. So there's a debate going on, and I'm firmly on one side of it, along with many colleagues, and we have Muslim colleagues on the other side. And it's up to us, to sincerely look for the truth and accept it. And if we are right, if the side I'm on, what I'm arguing for, is correct, then I would hope that the great minds of the past would agree with us. If we're wrong, then I would hope that they would agree with the other side. Yeah, but they're not here to tell us, so we can't. We don't know what they might believe. We can only deal with what we have, which is from all we know, and we know things they didn't know scientifically anyway. And we can only engage with the people in front of us, those other Muslim brothers and sisters who disagree with us on this. And thank you, and through forums like this, where we're able to discuss these questions anyway, of addressing these questions and having the debate. So thank you very much. May Allah accept and bless your work in doing this, in providing a platform for the debate of such questions where we can't answer all of them, but at least we can discuss them. As we say in Britain, famous English saying, better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it. Yeah, and I think that's very important.
That's a beautiful way to end this conversation. So thank you so very much, Dr. Usama Hasan. It was such a wonderful presentation, lecture come podcast. So I would like to thank you. And I hope I've learned a lot, and I hope my audience will get to learn a lot. And this will this will generate another debate, and people will learn a lot. People will try to read this stuff. And once again, thank you so very much, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. May Allah bless you. We're actually fasting here in Ramadan still. We have just over half an hour till sunset. So this, as you know, the most blessed time of the year, Ramadan. And so I do pray that God blesses you and your work and the podcast and your readers, listeners, everybody who's listened to this, whether you agree with us or not, whatever your views on this. We pray that God guides us all to the truth and enables us to recognize and accept the truth wherever it leads us, and that we continue to have a very blessed Ramzan and Eid. So thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.